He was the most private superstar of his time. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, didn't need television to cement his legend. He ruled the charts, he ruled Las Vegas, and he ruled the headlines. And yet, when it came to talk shows, Sinatra almost never said yes. He hated the bright lights of studio interviews, the canned laughter, the risk of revealing too much. That's why what happened on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, wasn't just another celebrity appearance. It was history. Imagine millions of Americans in the late 1970s, gathered around their living room TVs, when suddenly the impossible happened. Carson smiled, the curtain opened, and out walked Sinatra himself, a man who never did this sort of thing, suddenly on stage with the king of late night. From that moment, the audience knew they were witnessing lightning in a bottle. Sinatra didn't just appear. He joked. He reminisced. And yes, he even sang. It was one of the most shocking nights on live TV. And as we count down Sinatra's 5 unforgettable Carson moments, trust me, number 2 will leave you speechless. The late 1970s were still part of what many call the golden age of television. Families gathered around bulky wood-paneled sets. The NBC peacock flashed across the screen, and the familiar brass of The Tonight Show theme welcomed America into Carson's world. It wasn't just a late-night talk show. It was the national living room, a place where legends were crowned and reputations tested. And in that space, Carson reigned as the unchallenged king of late night. But then came a night that broke the mold. Frank Sinatra, arguably the most famous man in American music, stepped onto that same stage. To older viewers, he was the soundtrack of wartime romance and post-war optimism. To younger audiences, he was a living myth, the man who had run with the Rat Pack, who embodied cool itself. Sinatra didn't need Carson. His name alone could fill stadiums, and that was exactly what made his Tonight Show appearance so electric. Carson treated him not as an untouchable figure, but as an equal, teasing him, listening, giving him space to shine. For millions watching at home, it felt like witnessing 2 cultural giants sharing the same air, the same jokes, the same history. That night, nostalgia and immediacy collided, and television gave us a moment worth remembering forever. Moment 5, we travel back to 1977, a night when late-night television stopped being predictable. Johnny Carson had seen it all: politicians, comedians, movie stars, but nothing could prepare him, or his audience, for what happened when the studio curtain suddenly opened. Out walked Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was not the kind of guest you expected to see on a talk show. He rarely granted interviews, and when he did, it was usually in tightly controlled settings. To see him casually step onto Carson's stage was like spotting a comet. You knew it might never happen again. The audience inside NBC's studio gasped, then erupted into thunderous applause. People stood up from their seats. Carson himself froze for a split second, visibly caught off guard. For perhaps the only time in his career, the king of late night looked completely unprepared. He stammered, laughed nervously, then rose to shake Sinatra's hand. The camera caught every detail: Carson's wide-eyed disbelief, Sinatra's trademark grin, and the audience unable to contain themselves. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't promoted. It was pure television magic. In an age before viral moments, this was the kind of surprise that had everyone talking the next day at the office, the barbershop, or the family dinner table. What made it even more remarkable was Sinatra's demeanor. He didn't appear as the untouchable legend, but as a man at ease, exchanging quick jokes with Carson, soaking in the moment. For fans who had grown up with Sinatra's music, it felt as though he had stepped down from the pedestal and walked straight into their living rooms. For Carson, and for late-night history, it was lightning in a bottle. A moment that proved the magic of live television, when the unexpected could still leave millions breathless. Moment 4, the mood shifted from surprise to sheer delight. Sinatra had already broken the ice with his rare appearance, but what came next was even more memorable. Carson leaned back in his chair, that mischievous twinkle in his eye, and asked the question everyone wished they could. "Frank, what's it really like in Las Vegas when the curtain goes down?" What followed was unlike anything television audiences had ever heard. Sinatra began to unravel stories from backstage in Vegas, tales of the Rat Pack, of Dean Martin's practical jokes, of Sammy Davis Jr., sneaking into shows after his own sets just to laugh at the chaos. The audience howled as Sinatra mimicked the characters he once called friends, his timing sharp, his delivery effortless. It was as though the man who had guarded his private world for decades suddenly pulled back the curtain, if only for a few minutes. Carson could barely contain himself. He doubled over in laughter, clutching his desk, his face turning red. It wasn't the rehearsed laughter of a host. It was genuine, uncontrollable joy. The audience fed off it, clapping and cheering, as if they too had been invited to the smoky lounges of 1960s Vegas. For television history, this was rare gold. Sinatra wasn't crooning a standard or giving a polished interview. He was human, warm, and funny. He let the world see that behind the tuxedo and the legend was a man who loved telling stories, especially when Carson gave him the space to do it. By the time he wrapped the anecdote, Carson wiped tears from his eyes and leaned into Sinatra with a smile that seemed to say, "This is why we do television. For fans." It was the night Vegas itself came alive inside NBC's studio. Moment 3, Carson pulled off what many thought was impossible. Frank Sinatra, the man whose voice defined generations, was sitting in that iconic chair, charming the audience with stories. For most, that alone was a gift. But Johnny Carson wasn't about to let the night end without testing the waters. He leaned forward, grinning, and said with that classic Midwestern cool, "Frank, how about a little something for us tonight?" The studio erupted in nervous laughter. Nobody expected Sinatra to sing, certainly not on a talk show, and certainly not without preparation. Sinatra raised his eyebrows, chuckled, and shook his head as if to say, "You've got to be kidding me." But Carson didn't let go. With a playful persistence, he pressed again. "Come on, Frank, just a taste. No orchestra, no strings, just you." There was a long pause. Then Sinatra tilted his head, adjusted the microphone, and in that unmistakable tone, began to sing a few bars. No band, no arrangement, just the raw, unfiltered voice of the chairman of the board. The studio went silent at first, awed by the intimacy, before erupting into thunderous applause. Carson's reaction said it all. He leaned back, his face lit with childlike wonder, his hand covering his mouth in disbelief. The audience rose to their feet, many clapping along, realizing they were witnessing something that might never happen again. It wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was unforgettable. Sinatra singing live on The Tonight Show became the kind of moment people told their friends about for years. "Did you see it last night? Sinatra actually sang." For late-night television, it was pure history, unscripted magic that could never be recreated. Moment 2, the laughter faded, and the show took a turn no one saw coming. Johnny Carson had a way of disarming his guests, not with prying questions, but with silence, with patience, with that calm, steady gaze. And somehow, in the middle of all the jokes and nostalgia, Sinatra allowed the mask to slip. Carson asked about life on the road, about what it meant to be Frank Sinatra night after night. The audience leaned in, expecting another witty quip. But Sinatra paused. His smile softened, his voice lowered, and then he said it. That the hardest part of being Sinatra wasn't the spotlight, but what happened after it faded. He admitted that fame often left him feeling isolated, that the roar of the crowd could never fill the quiet of an empty room. The studio grew still. For a man who had always projected strength, control, and charm, this sudden confession felt shocking. The chairman of the board, the voice that had carried through wars and weddings, was telling America that he was lonely. Carson didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, letting Sinatra own the moment. Viewers at home felt it too. Across living rooms, people who had only known Sinatra as untouchable suddenly saw him as human, vulnerable, even fragile. It was a rare moment of honesty that television rarely captured, especially from someone so carefully guarded. When the audience finally applauded, it wasn't the wild cheer of excitement. It was softer, more respectful, as if they knew they had just witnessed a side of Sinatra that few ever would. For The Tonight Show, it was perhaps its rawest moment. The night the legend admitted he was, at times, just a man alone with his thoughts. Moment 1, we arrive at the moment that sealed this night in television history. The audience had already been surprised, entertained, and even moved to silence. But nothing compared to watching Johnny Carson and Frank Sinatra drop their guards completely and share a conversation that felt more like two old friends reminiscing than a late-night interview. It began with Carson leaning in, asking about the very first time he and Sinatra had crossed paths. Sinatra chuckled, shook his head, and began telling a story about a dinner long ago, full of awkward introductions, laughter, and the kind of small details only friends remember. Carson responded with his own memory, correcting Sinatra in jest, and soon the two were trading lines back and forth like a perfectly timed comedy duo. The crowd roared, not because of any rehearsed punchlines, but because they were witnessing authenticity. What made this exchange legendary wasn't just the humor, it was the intimacy. Two icons, who had come to symbolize American culture in very different ways, were suddenly humanized on stage. Sinatra, the crooner with the world at his feet, and Carson, the king of late night, spoke as equals, sharing stories about family, fame, and the absurdity of it all. The cameras caught every smile, every pause, every knowing glance. It was as if the entire nation had been invited to sit at the table with them. For once, television didn't feel like performance. It felt like eavesdropping on history. When the conversation wound down, the audience knew they had seen something unrepeatable. Carson leaned back, smiling with genuine warmth, while Sinatra placed a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't staged. It was timeless. For millions watching, It felt like the curtain had lifted on not just two careers, but two lives lived in the spotlight. As the lights dimmed and the final applause echoed through NBC's studio, one truth lingered. Nights like these were rare. Johnny Carson had welcomed thousands of guests, but Frank Sinatra's appearance was something else entirely. It wasn't just about the surprise entrance, the laughter, or even the live song. It was about watching two American legends share a space, a rhythm, and a trust that television almost never captured. For Carson, it was validation of his status as the king of late night. For Sinatra, it was proof that even the most private star could still astonish the world, not by singing to a packed arena, but by talking, laughing, and revealing pieces of himself in front of millions at home. Together, they created a broadcast that blurred the line between celebrity and human being. Decades later, these moments remind us why The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment. It was a cultural mirror. It gave us laughter, vulnerability, and history in real time. Sinatra's rare candor and Carson's effortless wit collided to give us television that still resonates. In the end, it wasn't just Sinatra on Carson's stage. It was America itself, witnessing lightning in a bottle, an unforgettable night where legends became human, and humanity became legendary. We've counted down 5 unforgettable moments. But the magic of Sinatra on The Tonight Show lives on far beyond this list. Which part struck you the most? Was it the shock of seeing him walk through that curtain? The laughter of those untold Vegas stories? Or the rare, unguarded honesty when he spoke about loneliness? These moments remind us that television can still feel alive decades later. Sinatra and Carson gave us not just entertainment, but memories that stitched themselves into American culture. And now, the question belongs to you. Who do you believe was the greatest legend Johnny Carson ever welcomed to his stage? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your memories. And if you enjoyed revisiting this golden night, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story in our Carson's Best Guests series. Because sometimes, the past isn't just nostalgia. It's a reminder of why legends never fade.